Hello everyone and Assalamu alaikum. This is Introduction to Psychology Part 2 by Dear Knowledge. Okay, so we have started the chapter of learning in which we have covered lots of topics in the chapter of learning. Let's start with the chapter overview. So here you can see on the screen, I have shared the topics which we will be covering in this chapter of learning. There are lots of topics which we have covered so far. So if I give you a chapter overview, we will be covering in this chapter. This chapter includes definition of learning, types of learning, which include classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and also it includes methods of learning, which includes trial and error, learning by insight, and observational learning. So if I give you chapter recap about what we have covered so far, so we have covered the definition of learning, which was about the lesson 1 of the chapter of learning. Now, in definition of learning, we have started with a proper case study, and with the reference of that case study, we covered the whole lesson of the definition of learning. Then, in the definition of learning, I've shared a proper definition of learning, and as I told you, that learning is a relative permanent change in behavior, which I also shared with all of my viewers in the lesson 1 about definition of learning. And we discussed every single point, every single word that was used in the definition of learning. And then after that, then lesson 2 is about types of learning. And in types of learning, we started the classical conditioning. Now, classical conditioning is basically part 1 of the lesson 2. And in classical conditioning, we learn about Ivan Pavlov. We shared a brief history of Ivan Pavlov and classical conditioning, and how did Ivan Pavlov discover classical conditioning, and why do we study him in the field of psychology, because he's a physiologist. So we shared a brief history in the classical conditioning, part 1, and in part 1 we also discussed about the definition of classical conditioning and the elements of classical conditioning, and we also shared a daily life example of classical conditioning. Then in part 1a of classical conditioning, we learned about stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination, and we also applied it on our daily life by sharing few examples of classical conditioning, or sharing few examples related to stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Then in part 1b, we learn about extinction and spontaneous recovery. What actually these terms means in the chapter or in the lesson of classical conditioning, and we also shared few examples of extinction and spontaneous recovery, including Ivan Pavlov and his dogs, as well as we also applied it on our daily life. And then after that, this is going to be lesson 2, types of learning, part 1c, higher order conditioning. So in this video, we will learn about what actually higher order conditioning is, and why do we study higher order conditioning in classical conditioning, what actually this term is. So let's start with higher order conditioning. Now, another concept in classical conditioning is higher order conditioning. And the definition would include higher order conditioning occurs when a strong conditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, causing the neutral stimulus to become a second conditioned stimulus. So this occurs when a strong conditioned stimulus is paired with neutral stimulus. Now, the strong conditioned stimulus can actually play the part of an unconditioned stimulus, and the previous neutral stimulus becomes a second conditioned stimulus. Now, for example, let's assume that Pavlov has conditioned his dogs to salivate at the sound of the bell. Now, what would happen if just before Pavlov rang the bell, he snapped his fingers? So the sequence would be snap, bell, salivation. Or in other words, we say neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. Because we have studied in the classical conditioning that when the food was presented, the food was actually, the bell was actually a neutral stimulus, but once it was paired with the unconditioned stimulus, which was food, it presented a conditioned response, and the neutral stimulus became a conditioned stimulus. Now here we have taken the same conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, and salivation, which is the conditioned response, but before the bell, the snap of a finger is now neutral stimulus because it is now presented before the bell, and there is no such effect of snap of a finger on salivation right now. So the sequence snap, bell, salivation, or neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. If this happens enough times, the finger snap will eventually also produce a salivation response. Now, the finger snap becomes associated with the bell through the same process that the bell became associated with the food originally and is now another conditioned stimulus. Because the snap of a finger, which had no effect on salivation, but once this process was repeated again and again, now the dog have learned that before the bell, a snap of a finger happens, and then after the snap of finger, there's a bell, and then there's food, and then there is salivation. Then the dog will learn this sequence. So the snap of finger will become the conditioned stimulus. So that's why we say higher order conditioning occurs when a strong conditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, causing the neutral stimulus to become a second conditioned stimulus. So this was all about today's video. If your concept is clear, you can like the video. If there was any point which was confusing, you did not get it, you can ask us in the comment section and we will be happy to help you out. Plus, if you're new to this channel, you can subscribe to our channel. Click on the bell icon so you will never ever miss any notification. You can also share the link of this channel, the link of our videos with your family members and friends, because sharing is caring. Until then, Allah Hafiz.